Hey guys, tonight we begin another journey. Imagine you're standing in a grand dining hall somewhere in medieval France around the year 1325. Picture the scene clearly. Torchlight flickering gently on walls, lined with tapestries depicting noble hunts, long wooden tables draped in fine linens, and the soft clink of silver spoons against polished metal dishes echoing through the room. It seems like a scene right out of your favorite historical drama, a noble feast, perhaps celebrating the successful return of some brave knight or the union of two powerful families. You might imagine yourself comfortably seated amongst the laughter, the clinking goblets, and mouth-watering dishes of roasted meats, glazed with honey piles of sweetened fruits and steaming loaves of freshly baked white bread. But here's the twist in medieval Europe, you were determined not just how you ate, but what you ate with, where you sat, and even whether your plate was made of gold or stale bread. That lavish feast that seems so inviting in your imagination was more fantasy than reality, unless you were fortunate enough to have been born into the nobility. And if not, well, let's just say things got awkward fast. Let's gently peel back the tapestry and take a closer look at the true divide quietly etched into every medieval dinner table. For starters, let's consider the spoon an innocent enough utensil by modern standards. Today's spoons are mostly an afterthought. You probably grab whatever's clean and nearest in the cutlery drawer. But back then, your spoon loudly announced your social status. For the wealthy silver spoons weren't just shiny, they symbolized purity and prestige. Rich families commissioned spoons engraved with intricate family crests, signaling lineage and pride every time someone sipped a bit of soup. Imagine each spoonful of stew quietly whispering, "We're important," as it slipped into noble mouths. And at the other end of this shiny spectrum, the humble wooden spoon. For peasants, sharing a single wooden spoon at meals wasn't an eccentric family tradition, it was economic reality. No engraving, no family crests, just the rough feel of carved wood scraping against chapped lips. If you happened to misplace that wooden spoon, you'd simply be eating with your hands. Honestly, medieval peasants probably had fewer spoons per family than the average 21st century household loses each month. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was mildly humiliating, especially since everyone was fully aware that somewhere in a castle, a mile or two away, nobles were gently polishing their silverware every evening. Moving on to the plate itself, if you were nobility in medieval France, your dinner wasn't just served on a platter. It was presented on a carefully crafted piece of metal, gold, or silver, depending on how hard you wanted to flex your family's status. And if not metal, then at least polished pewter, brightly shining beneath candlelight, adding yet another layer of quiet sophistication. Every meal became an artful statement, a way of quietly reminding your dinner guests exactly who had the wealth and power. Meanwhile, for peasants, plates were more edible. No joke, the typical peasant meal was served on trenchers, which were essentially slabs of old stale bread that acted like primitive plates. Why bread? Because once you were done eating, you could actually eat your plate if you were desperate enough, and you often were. Alternatively, you might generously feed it to the pigs, giving your livestock a taste of human leftovers. This practice quietly underscores how precious and scarce food truly was for the lower classes. Each bite of dinner had to count not just for sustenance, but survival. And speaking of bread, it wasn't just a utensil, it was also an indicator of class. Nobility got the best bread, soft and white and refined, representing purity and wealth. In contrast, peasants got rye bread, rough, heavy, and usually packed with a gritty surprise or two, thanks to careless milling processes. You see, medieval millers didn't exactly adhere to food safety standards. Bits of stone from the grinding process would routinely find their way into loaves, making every meal a literal tooth-breaking event. Bread wasn't a delight to the palate, it was a daily trial. For the peasants, dinner wasn't something you anticipated, it was something you endured. The seating arrangement in medieval dining halls also reinforced the social gap. At the noble's feast, the high table stood raised on a dais, looking down upon all the others. Lords and their special guests sat elevated visibly above the common servants and retainers who clustered below. It was a simple but potent visual reminder. You weren't just below them socially, you were physically beneath them. The closer you sat to the kitchen or the entrance, the lower your status. If you were especially unlucky, you found yourself stuck at a far table barely illuminated by a stray candle, struggling to see your own dinner. Meals were public rituals, carefully choreographed acts of hierarchy. Even the tablecloth was a silent statement of wealth and privilege. Nobles wiped their mouths and hands on white linen cloths, freshly washed, perfumed, and changed frequently to maintain their pristine whiteness. Meanwhile, peasants typically had no such luxury. Your sleeve, or if you were lucky, an old rag, was the only napkin available. Washing hands regularly wasn't even a widely accepted practice among the poorer classes. Germ theory was centuries away, so medieval dining was less about hygiene and more about sheer survival. To the noble diners above, cleanliness symbolized purity and divine favor. To the peasants below, cleanliness was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. Historians still debate whether these dining traditions intentionally reinforced class divisions or simply reflected a hierarchy that already existed. Did the way medieval people ate quietly help maintain social order, or was it merely an unavoidable byproduct of the era's harsh realities? Whatever the answer, one thing remains clear. Medieval meals quietly and effectively split society in two, right down the middle of the dinner table. As you gently sink deeper into this picture, consider the subtle cruelty embedded in these small daily routines. Imagine living in a world where the simple act of sitting down for dinner each evening reaffirmed precisely who you were, and more importantly, who you could never hope to become. Where every spoonful of soup, every bite of bread reminded you of your place in the social hierarchy, whether at the dazzling peak or at the grim, gritty bottom. You might wonder how peasants tolerated such obvious injustice at every meal. But remember, medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of indignation. Surviving from day to day was challenging enough without worrying about silver spoons or fine linens. Acceptance, quiet resignation, and pragmatic survival shaped their daily lives far more powerfully than any lingering sense of injustice. They knew exactly where they stood, usually at the bottom, scraping by on whatever the fields, forests, and fortune would yield. Tonight, as you drift gently towards sleep, perhaps you'll feel a newfound appreciation for your kitchen utensils, your dinner plates, and even that humble slice of bread in your pantry. The luxuries you casually overlook today were symbols of profound privilege back then. Tiny everyday comforts, unimaginable to countless medieval souls. As you rest tonight, savor this final thought. The quiet daily rhythms of eating something we all share across centuries still quietly reflect the profound divisions in every society. Even now, meals quietly reveal our comforts, our anxieties, and our dreams. But for tonight, let's leave medieval France behind. Dim the lights, find comfort in the soft hum of the world around you, and drift gently into the warm embrace of your own quiet dreams. Breakfast, if you can even call it that, begins quietly. Let's gently ease back into our medieval morning, this time in rural England around the year 1350. You're not waking up to the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee or buttery pancakes sizzling invitingly on the griddle. No sunny side up eggs, no avocado toast waiting patiently on your Instagram feed. Instead, picture yourself rolling stiffly from a straw-stuffed mattress onto a packed earth floor, eyes barely open, greeted only by the dull ache in your bones and the whisper of morning chill slipping through thin walls. Forget the warmth of central heating. Your medieval central heating is the cow sleeping on the other side of the wall. Breakfast isn't energizing or comforting here. Breakfast doesn't gently awaken your senses or fuel your body. Rather, breakfast is something that just happens to you. You don't plan breakfast, you surrender to it quietly, resigning yourself to whatever miserable meal your station in life dictates. And if you're a medieval peasant, your first meal of the day is likely to be the gastronomic equivalent of getting stuck in traffic, frustrating, inevitable, and almost aggressively disappointing. Let's begin with the noble breakfast for contrast. At the upper end of society, breakfast might feature freshly baked pastries, sweetened with precious honey, sprinkled delicately with spices imported at great expense from far-off lands. Imagine your breakfast table piled high with dates from distant deserts, figs and almonds from warmer climates, perhaps even preserved fruits shimmering gently in syrup. Your first sip of morning beverage would likely be sweetened wine or even warmed spiced ale, an early version of mulled beer. A leisurely morning meal wasn't a necessity, it was another way to quietly demonstrate wealth and refinement. Now, gently but firmly, let's pull you away from this culinary fantasy and drop you back where most medieval souls found themselves: cold, damp cottages surrounded by fields and endless toil. Your peasant breakfast typically offered just two main choices: leftover rye bread, or if you were particularly unfortunate, porridge. But let's be clear, this wasn't the comforting oatmeal you might imagine, lightly sprinkled with brown sugar or topped with fresh berries. Medieval porridge was a gloomy bowl of grainy uncertainty, typically made from oats or barley cooked until it resembled glue. This porridge wasn't enjoyed, it was consumed, usually with grim determination. Occasionally, the porridge might be improved with whatever was handy herbs plucked from nearby fields, maybe a pinch of salt. But flavor wasn't really the point. Nutrition wasn't a medieval concept people pondered carefully. Eating was survival, plain and simple. Medieval breakfasts were the original minimalist meals, long before minimalism was a lifestyle trend. But unlike today's minimalist menus, these meals weren't carefully curated, they were just brutally sparse. And here's the quietly miserable twist about medieval porridge. Reheating wasn't a quick zap in the microwave. Instead, yesterday's porridge often sat quietly in a pot overnight, congealing into a semi-solid gelatinous lump. In the morning, you'd slice it like bread, chew it down slowly and quietly. Ponder your life choices. It was breakfast by default, bleak but necessary, eaten without joy ceremony or much thought beyond the vague hope that tomorrow might be slightly better. It rarely was. Peasant children sometimes didn't even receive breakfast at all. Not because parents were neglectful, but simply because food had to stretch as far as humanly possible. Children were taught early that hunger wasn't a feeling to be soothed. It was something you quietly accepted, like bad weather or sore muscles. Breakfast was often skipped altogether, saved for midday when the body simply couldn't go on any longer without nourishment. But let's briefly pause here gently, pulling you back into modernity to appreciate how comfortably luxurious your breakfasts have become. Perhaps tomorrow morning when you sip your hot coffee or spread jam on your fresh toast, you'll quietly thank whatever cosmic force placed you in the era of supermarkets and convenience stores. Medieval peasants never knew such comfort, and they likely wouldn't have believed you if you tried explaining what brunch meant. Returning to medieval England, breakfast wasn't just sparse, it was socially fraught. Eating too much or showing any sort of gastronomic indulgence early in the day was viewed suspiciously. Breakfasting heartily was subtly perceived as arrogance, a quiet attempt at elevating yourself above your peers. It implied you were either stealing food or enjoying suspicious wealth. Peasant communities were closely knit, highly observant, and quick to note any irregularities. A luxurious breakfast might lead neighbors to quietly whisper questions about your character or activities. On the other hand, not eating enough invited ridicule or suspicion of poverty beyond the acceptable norm. Medieval communities operated under a quiet, unspoken rule of balance. You couldn't appear too comfortable, nor could you allow yourself to seem destitute. Breakfast, in a weird and socially complex way, became another unspoken medieval test of character. Eat just enough to survive, and you quietly signaled your virtue. Eat too much or too little, and you'd find yourself the subject of quiet gossip that might linger longer than your hunger. Historians still debate whether medieval peasants truly considered breakfast a proper meal or just a nutritional necessity, something eaten mechanically rather than enjoyed. Some scholars argue breakfast evolved from practical necessity, especially during intense harvest or planting seasons when energy demands were greatest. Others quietly counter that breakfast remained rare and largely symbolic, consumed only when resources permitted, reflecting the harsh realities of medieval agriculture. One curious historical tidbit often overlooked is how medieval monasteries treated breakfast. Monks typically rose early to begin prayers well before dawn. Despite their spiritual austerity, monastic breakfasts often surpassed what peasants ate. Bread and cheese were staples, sometimes paired with simple ale. Monks quietly argued they required additional nourishment to sustain their long hours of spiritual devotion. But it likely wasn't lost on peasant neighbors that monks, supposedly humble servants of God, managed to enjoy morning meals slightly more substantial than their own. Adding to the quiet complexity was the medieval custom of hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, or guests were often given breakfast more generous than a peasant family ate regularly. Why? Because medieval hospitality dictated generosity toward visitors, even if it meant quietly depriving your own household to avoid appearing inhospitable. Sharing limited resources, especially in the morning, underscored a quiet yet essential social obligation, subtly reinforcing communal bonds. Hospitality could quietly elevate or lower your family's standing. It was generosity by necessity, heartfelt, yet deeply practical. Breakfast for medieval peasants was in many ways quietly reflective of broader social and economic realities. It wasn't just a meal, it was a microcosm of medieval life itself. Simple, unadorned, and starkly pragmatic breakfast laid bare the brutal realities of medieval existence. It stripped away romantic notions of knights' castles and banquets quietly reminding everyone at dawn that survival was always uncertain, hunger, constant, and life a fragile balancing act. Perhaps now, as you gently sink deeper into your pillow, you'll quietly reflect on how breakfast shapes our mornings, even today comfortably distant, yet faintly connected to medieval hardships. Tomorrow, your cereal might taste slightly sweeter, your coffee richer, and your toast warmer, simply because you've quietly revisited a world where breakfast wasn't guaranteed enjoyable or even particularly welcome. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift off, remember gently medieval breakfasts were quietly endured rather than savored, but also remember the silent strength and resilience it took to wake each morning and face hunger without complaint. There's dignity in that quiet acceptance, a dignity often overlooked, yet worth remembering as we drift gently into our own far more comfortable sleep. Let's slide gently into another medieval morning, this time in a humble German village around the year 1375. Your stomach quietly grumbles, reminding you it's time for something most people today would happily take for granted: bread. Simple, comforting bread. Soft, fluffy, crusty, golden warm from the oven. Just imagining it probably makes your mouth water slightly, conjuring visions of artisanal loaves, dusted gently with flour, waiting patiently to be spread thickly with butter or jam. But here's your gentle, quiet reminder. Medieval bread wasn't always as friendly as it appeared. In fact, if you were born at the wrong end of society, your morning bread might feel more like a personal insult than a nourishing meal. Welcome to medieval Europe's crusty divide, the subtle yet unforgiving gap between the soft, refined bread of the wealthy and the dense, gritty slabs of rye bread endured by peasants. Imagine stepping into the local village bakery, if you could even call it that. There's no cheery bell ringing above the door, no neatly labeled pastries, no smiling barista asking if you'd like your latte with oat milk today. Instead, you shuffle quietly into a cramped, smoky space, lit only by the soft glow of embers and a flickering candle or two. The air smells strongly of yeast-charred grain and the faintly acrid smoke of a wood-fired oven that's probably older than your grandfather. Your loaf won't be carefully wrapped in parchment paper. It's handed over roughly a dense lump, warm to the touch, but suspiciously heavy, as though the baker accidentally handed you a brick by mistake. If you were fortunate enough to belong to the nobility, however, your experience would be wildly different. Noble bread was made from wheat, white, delicate, carefully sifted and milled multiple times until it resembled fine powder. Bakers employed by wealthy families took pride in producing loaves so white and fluffy that merely slicing into them was a quiet performance of status. White bread wasn't just delicious, it symbolized purity, wealth, and sophistication. The whiter and lighter your bread, the higher your standing quietly climbed in society's eyes. Peasant bread, however, was a quiet reminder of your lower station in life. It was typically made from rye or barley, hearty, durable grains that grew well in the colder northern climates but lacked the appealing softness of wheat. Rye flour, darker and heavier, produced dense loaves, often described politely by historians as substantial. Less politely, medieval bread was dense enough to function as a makeshift weapon if necessity arose. Imagine trying to tear a piece off your breakfast loaf, only to realize it requires the strength of at least 2 adults, preferably with some woodworking tools handy. But the density wasn't the worst part. Medieval milling processes were notoriously rough. Millstones used for grinding grain often shed tiny fragments of stone into the flour, making bread an unexpected dental hazard. Each bite contained hidden surprises, tiny grains of grit capable of cracking teeth and leaving you quietly contemplating a future of medieval dentistry itself, a bleak prospect. Historical records quietly note that dental wear among medieval peasants was extreme, largely due to consuming bread made from such gritty flour. Every meal carried with it a quiet, tooth-chipping risk. Historians still debate whether medieval millers were deliberately careless or simply victims of inadequate technology. Some argue medieval millers paid by volume, quietly added cheaper fillers, sand or stone dust, to stretch their product and profits. Others quietly defend them, suggesting medieval milling techniques simply couldn't achieve today's cleanliness standards. Regardless, peasants bore the brunt of this subtle malpractice, biting quietly into loaves filled with gritty surprises. This quiet injustice was not lost on the peasants themselves. Bread riots were occasionally recorded when grain shortages became particularly severe. Anger quietly simmered, sometimes boiling over when bakeries produced loaves lighter or smaller than expected. Medieval peasants, though often painted as passively accepting their fate, weren't entirely docile. Bread was a lifeline. Threaten its quality or quantity, and you'd quietly invite communal anger. Interestingly, bread also functioned as a subtle political tool. Nobility often used the distribution of bread to demonstrate generosity or power, quietly providing surplus loaves during festivals or religious holidays. This charitable gesture, seemingly benevolent, was quietly strategic, reinforcing loyalty, social hierarchy, and dependence. Bread was never merely food. It was quietly woven into the social and political fabric of medieval life. Adding further complexity, medieval law regulated bread strictly. Bakers were frequently monitored by officials who quietly ensured bread met certain weight and quality standards. Failure could result in humiliation. Bakers caught cheating were publicly punished, sometimes even placed in stocks, holding deliberately heavy, gritty loaves as a symbolic penalty. Yet enforcement varied wildly quietly, influenced by wealth, location, and personal relationships. Another quiet indignity was the use of stale bread as a plate substitute known as trenchers. At noble tables, thick slabs of stale bread absorbed meat juices during feasts, later given to peasants or tossed to dogs. It's a quietly sobering image. Bread, too stale for nobility, quietly passed along as charity or discarded like trash. But peasants rarely complained. Stale bread flavored by meat drippings was a rare treat, quietly savored despite its indignity. Even medieval bakers quietly faced their own unique burdens. Baking was physically demanding. Kneading heavy rye dough required immense strength and endurance. Bakers inhaled flour dust daily, quietly damaging their lungs over time. Historical accounts suggest medieval bakers often suffered from respiratory illnesses, quietly accepting this occupational hazard. Baking bread wasn't romantic or artisanal. It was dangerous, exhausting work quietly carried out behind village scenes. Medieval bread recipes varied by region, reflecting local agriculture and climate. In Northern Europe, rye dominated, resilient and adaptable to harsh weather. Southern regions produced softer wheat breads, quietly enjoyed by both rich and poor, though still vastly different in quality. Regardless of location, bread quietly reflected broader economic and social realities, subtly but persistently highlighting class distinctions. The subtle cruelty of bread's social symbolism wasn't lost on medieval peasants. Bread wasn't merely sustenance, it quietly reinforced their social limitations daily. Nobles dined on airy, refined loaves, symbolizing comfort and abundance, while peasants chewed their dense rye bread, each bite quietly reminding them of their place in the medieval hierarchy. It was a quiet cruelty, familiar, accepted, but no less powerful for its subtlety. Yet despite this quiet injustice, medieval peasants endured. Bread gritty and dense was still nourishment. It quietly sustained families through long, harsh winters and grueling harvests. Rye bread, though challenging, provided vital nutrients, quietly keeping communities alive through famine and plague. In its gritty imperfection lay quiet resilience, a testament to the stubborn determination of medieval life. Tonight, as you drift gently towards sleep, consider quietly how bread, something so humble and familiar today, once quietly symbolized stark divisions. Reflect softly on how our meals still quietly speak volumes about our lives, our privileges, and our struggles. Perhaps tomorrow morning your breakfast toast will taste sweeter, softer, warmer, quietly appreciated in ways medieval peasants could scarcely imagine. For now, dim the lights, soften your breathing, and let the quiet rhythm of history guide you gently into sleep. Remember quietly, even in the harshest conditions, humanity finds ways to endure, persist, and quietly nourish itself. Good night and sleep gently. Now let's gently slide into midday, the forgotten hour that quietly deepened the divide between medieval Europe's rich and poor. This time our story brings us softly to the bustling streets of Florence, Italy, around the year 1380. As you move slowly through narrow cobblestone lanes filled with chatter shouts of merchants and the aroma of roasted meats drifting from the taverns, you're probably imagining lunchtime as something comfortably familiar. A midday break, a small reward halfway through a busy day, or perhaps simply a quiet moment to savor a sandwich or salad. But here's the quiet twist in medieval times. Lunch wasn't universally celebrated or even universally eaten. Instead, this midday meal quietly reinforced class boundaries subtly but unmistakably, marking who had luxury and who simply survived. Let's start gently at the top. For Florence's nobility, lunch was yet another quiet opportunity for luxury. Midday meals for the wealthy weren't rushed bites of food eaten hurriedly at a desk or between tasks. Instead, noble lunches were leisurely banquets, mini feasts, offering courses of spiced meats, sweet pastries, and fragrant vegetables cooked with rich sauces. Imagine stepping into a noble household. Around noon, servants gracefully carry silver platters, piled high with delicacies like roasted duck, glazed with honey, almond-encrusted trout, fresh from local streams, and creamy cheeses imported from nearby farms. At noble lunches, conversation flowed gently, punctuated by the soft clink of goblets filled generously with spiced wine or imported beverages from distant lands. Eating was not merely a necessity, it was entertainment socialization, a quiet reaffirmation of privilege. Nobles dined leisurely, discussing politics, gossip, or simply enjoying the refined ambiance of their surroundings. Every bite subtly reminded guests of the host's wealth, taste, and influence. Meanwhile, just beyond the noble doors, lunchtime was starkly different for Florence's working classes and peasants. Instead of leisurely banquets, midday meals for the lower classes were sparse, practical, and usually unappealing. In fact, historians gently note that many peasants didn't really recognize lunch as a proper meal. It was more of a functional pause, a practical necessity rather than a social event. Meals eaten during midday were sometimes viewed suspiciously, as if stopping work to eat signaled laziness or extravagance, quietly frowned upon by fellow laborers who often continued working straight through to evening. Peasant lunches typically consisted of leftovers from previous meals or hastily prepared food. A common midday meal might be a thin soup made from whatever scraps could be gathered, vegetable peelings, wild greens, bones boiled until flavor emerged reluctantly. There were no luxurious cuts of meat, no sweet pastries, no delicacies gently drizzled with honey. Instead, peasant lunches quietly conveyed the harsh realities of medieval survival. If you were fortunate enough to have anything to eat at midday, it was often cold, watery, and eaten quickly without ceremony or joy. Lunch for peasants wasn't a relaxing break. It was a momentary pause barely long enough to quiet their stomachs' growls before resuming hard labor. Eating too slowly or resting too long invited criticism from supervisors or neighbors who quietly judged your work ethic. Social expectations subtly but powerfully controlled even these brief midday pauses, turning lunch from comfort into quietly stressful interludes. And yet, as sparse as lunch might have been, medieval workers quietly adapted ingenious ways to make their midday food stretch further. One popular method was perpetual stew, an endlessly bubbling pot into which whatever ingredients available were thrown daily, simmering continuously. Peasants would ladle out small bowls of this never-ending stew, quietly hoping each new ingredient masked yesterday's leftovers sufficiently. Eating this stew required quiet courage. Each spoonful, an unpredictable mix, sometimes surprisingly tasty, often deeply questionable. Historical records quietly mention perpetual stews lasting weeks or months, ingredients becoming increasingly dubious as the stew persisted. Each bowl consumed quietly reinforced a peasant's resilience and adaptability. While nobles enjoyed carefully prepared distinct dishes, peasants silently faced uncertainty at each meal. This quiet bravery facing a bowl of ambiguous stew day after day deserves quiet recognition as a testament to medieval endurance. Yet despite lunch's practical necessity, there was a quiet suspicion surrounding midday meals. Medieval society was quietly rigid about meals, aligning strictly with the natural rhythms of day and night. Eating heavily at midday, outside typical breakfast and dinner routines, was quietly frowned upon as indulgent and morally questionable, particularly among peasants. Lunch was quietly associated with idleness, extravagance, or simply trying too hard to imitate nobility. Medieval moralists often cautioned against midday eating, quietly suggesting it weakened character, distracted from honest labor, or encouraged sinful luxury. Ironically, monasteries across medieval Europe quietly defied these norms. Monks routinely paused midday for lunch, albeit modest and carefully regulated. Monastic lunches typically involved simple fare bread, cheese, vegetables, consumed quickly before resuming prayers or manual labor. While monastic lunches quietly reflected religious moderation, they still subtly elevated monks above the common peasant, quietly exempting them from harsher social expectations. Peasants, noticing monks' relative comfort, quietly accepted it as divine privilege, though the quiet irony surely wasn't lost on them. Historians still debate whether lunch genuinely reinforced social divisions or merely reflected them. Was midday eating quietly discouraged because it disrupted productivity, or was lunch deliberately withheld to control laborers' expectations? Some scholars argue lunch restrictions were practical. Peasants couldn't afford leisurely midday breaks. Others quietly suggest restricting lunch was subtle social control, ensuring peasants remained perpetually industrious, hungry, and dependent. Whatever the truth, lunch quietly deepened medieval class divides, emphasizing who had leisure and who didn't. Interestingly, urban artisans and tradespeople occupied a quiet middle ground. Unlike peasants, tradespeople frequently took midday meals. Though modest, their lunches quietly surpassed rural counterparts. Guild members might quietly gather in taverns or workshops for bread, cheese, and ale, enjoying brief socializing before returning to work. These lunches subtly signaled tradespeople's elevated social position, not nobility, yet quietly distinct from peasant hardship. Guild lunches reinforced quiet camaraderie, professional identity, and subtle social superiority over rural laborers. And while lunch quietly reinforced hierarchy, it also gently underscored medieval hospitality customs. Offering guests midday meals quietly demonstrated generosity, respect, and social standing. Even modest households quietly prioritized feeding midday visitors generously, temporarily blurring distinctions between wealthy and poor. Hospitality, though temporary, quietly united communities reflecting shared cultural values, despite ongoing inequalities. Lunch quietly mirrored broader medieval tensions between leisure and labor, luxury and necessity, abundance and scarcity. Each bite quietly communicated status, wealth, and expectations. Eating habits subtly encoded medieval values, quietly dictating how people should behave, what they should desire, and even when hunger was appropriate. Meals weren't just sustenance, they quietly enforced morality, identity, and social conformity. Tonight, as you drift gently towards sleep, quietly ponder lunch's subtle complexities, how something seemingly simple could carry profound social meaning. Tomorrow, when you pause midday for your meal, perhaps a sandwich, salad, or bowl of soup, quietly appreciate your freedom from medieval expectations, suspicion, and judgment. Enjoy your lunch without quiet anxiety, savoring food prepared exactly as you choose. And as you close your eyes, now remember gently history's quiet lessons echo softly around every meal, subtly shaping how we eat, think, and live. Lunch quietly unites and divides, comforts and complicates, reflecting deeper human truths. Let these quiet reflections accompany you tonight softly, guiding you into restful sleep. Good night, sleep gently, and perhaps dream quietly of simpler times and simpler meals, savored freely without subtle judgment or quiet anxiety. You've made it through a medieval morning on stale porridge and tough bread. You've trudged through muddy fields, maybe repaired a leaky roof or fed animals before the sun hit its peak. Now let's talk about something modern folks might call a snack. A small indulgence, a tasty reward, maybe a bit of fun between meals. But this is medieval Europe, year 1400, in a dusty village somewhere in the heart of Castile, Spain. There's no corner shop, no vending machine, no grab and go. And no one is handing out free samples of almond-stuffed pastries or cheese cubes on toothpicks. Here a snack is less of a craving and more of a scavenger hunt. Let's begin as always with the nobles. For the wealthy, snacking was a gentle luxury, woven into the daily rhythm as elegant and casual as a yawn. In the late morning or early afternoon, servants might bring trays of candied nuts, dried figs, preserved pears soaked in honey, or little cakes infused with saffron. These weren't just food, they were edible ornaments, signs of status. Imagine sitting by a garden window, plucking honeyed almonds from a golden plate while listening to the lute. It wasn't just nourishment, it was leisure. And the best part, you didn't have to work for it. snacks came to you? Now contrast that with a peasant farmer just a mile away crouching in the field under the merciless sun. His version of a snack: a handful of dried peas stuffed into a cloth pouch before dawn. Or maybe if he had something to celebrate, a piece of old cheese so salty it could double as currency. There's no honey, no figs, no delicate tray service. There's just food, if he remembered to pack any. For peasants, snacking wasn't part of daily routine. It was a rare, almost accidental event. You snacked when you had leftovers. You snacked when the season was kind. You snacked when you didn't give your extra bread crust to the goat. There was no midday munchies. There was survival and the briefest moment of not feeling hungry. One of the most common snacks among peasants was roasted broad beans, coarsely dried, stored in pouches, and chewed like tiny pebbles to pass the time. They were loud, dry, and borderline unpleasant. But they traveled well. In a world without fridges, sometimes chewy and awful, beat fresh and spoiled. But now let's take a strange detour to a place where snacks were sometimes plenty: the monastery. Yes, those quiet halls filled with candlelight and chanted prayers also harbored surprisingly snack-rich environments. Monks, you see, followed a strict schedule that included small breaks and small bites. They'd quietly chew on fruit-toasted bread, dipped in wine, or even spoonfuls of honey if it was deemed medicinal. They didn't call it snacking, of course, more like spiritual nourishment. But the stomach doesn't care what you call it. Monasteries often kept bees, vineyards, and gardens. That meant monks had access to foods many peasants only dreamed of: grapes, nuts, soft cheeses, small things but rich with meaning in a world where every bite mattered. So while Brother Abel gently hummed psalms, he might also be nibbling the 14th century equivalent of trail mix. Historians still debate whether these snacks were truly indulgent or merely practical. Some claim the monks' modest bites kept them focused during long hours of scripture. Others suspect the line between need and want blurred after a few too many almond breaks. But here's a small truth. If God disapproved of snacking, he seemed to have looked the other way in quite a few abbeys. Back in noble courts, snacking also served a social purpose. Sharing sugared almonds or dried plums during court gatherings wasn't just about keeping hunger at bay. It was about showcasing refinement. Nobles showed off their imported goods, the way we flash designer bags or high-tech gadgets. You didn't just eat the plum. You announced that it came from a merchant in Genoa and that it cost more than most servants earned in a month. Even snacks had resumes. Peasants, of course, had no such luxury, but they did have festivals. And during those rare village celebrations, weddings, Saint Days harvest, feasts, snacks, transformed, however briefly, into joy. Someone roasted chestnuts, someone else fried strips of dough in animal fat and dusted them with ash or sugar, if they could afford it. You might get a fig if you were lucky, or a lump of sweetened curds. For a moment, just a moment, peasant snacks weren't just edible, they were delightful. But festivals faded and the fields waited. And so the mundane returned. The peasant snack once again became a crust of bread dipped in ale, or maybe a foraged apple, sour and spotted but edible. It was never about taste. It was about holding hunger back for another hour. Just one more hour. Still, these tiny bites mattered. Imagine working 12 hours in a muddy field, digging turnips out of frozen soil. A chunk of hard cheese can feel like a miracle. Even just the act of pausing to chew it reminded peasants they were still human, not just tools yoked to the land. Humorously, some noble snacks would have confused the average peasant. Consider the medieval fad of sugared violets. Yes, actual flower petals coated in sugar and eaten delicately during garden walks. While nobles debated whether violets or rose petals had a more elevated aroma, peasants were busy gnawing on wild onions. Then again, some peasant snacks would terrify a noble's delicate constitution. One rural snack involved roasted pig fat scraped onto stale bread. Another chewing raw garlic bulbs whole for energy. Effective, but probably not great for courtship. Historians still argue whether snacking was frowned upon for moral reasons. Some religious texts warned against gluttony by degrees, the idea that tiny indulgences added up to sin. But others suggest the aversion to snacking was purely logistical. Food spoiled quickly, meals were precious. You didn't nibble between them, you stretched what little you had. Yet across all classes, one thing about snacking remained constant. It was personal. Whether wrapped in gold foil or a sweaty cloth, snacks came from your pocket, your pouch, your home. They were yours even if you had to share. A small private piece of your day. And sometimes even in the most difficult seasons, people found clever ways to treat themselves. Villagers dried apples on rooftops, strung them on cords, and snuck slices into church services. Children stole sour berries from hedges and bragged about it for days. Old women sucked on licorice roots, swearing they soothed aches. And some clever soul always had a small stash of honeycomb hidden away for emergencies, heartbreaks, or birthdays. Perhaps most charmingly, animals got snacks too. Medieval households saved crumbs for dogs and tossed gristle to cats. Horses got apples. Chickens got whatever the children didn't want. Even the livestock, it seems, needed something between meals. So tonight, as you lie in bed, breathing softly, think about your snacks. Your chocolate-covered almonds, your cookies, your secret bag of chips hidden in the cupboard. And quietly, thank the 1,000 anonymous hands that came before you snacking quietly between harvests, between prayers, between the never-ending rhythm of medieval labor. Snacks were small, but they meant something. They were stolen time, a breath. A reminder that even in the harshest centuries, humans still reached for comfort in the quietest ways. Now dim the lights, maybe nibble something sweet one last time and let yourself drift. No one will judge you for snacking after midnight. You've survived the porridge. You've gnawed the gritty bread. You've sipped thin soup and nibbled the occasional dry pea. But now it's evening. The air has cooled, the fields have gone quiet, and somewhere in a manor house, not far from your smoky peasant cottage, the lords and ladies are sitting down for the event of the day, the medieval dinner party. If lunch was the quiet divider, then dinner was the grand separator. This wasn't just a meal. This was the meal, the social stage, the theater of hierarchy. And the further you sat, from the center of the table, physically or figuratively, the more you felt it. Let's begin gently high up, in the great hall of a noble household in England, around the year 1410. Candles are flickering on the walls, casting golden shadows over polished shields and tapestries that haven't been washed since your grandfather was born. The servants are rushing about in near silence, each one trying not to make eye contact with anyone above their station. Why? Because this is more than food. This is a quiet display of dominance. At the high table perched on a slightly raised platform sit the nobles. They are surrounded by embroidered cushions, tall-backed chairs, and dishes that shimmer in candlelight. Everything here whispers elegance. Every movement, every bite, every glance carries meaning. They're not just eating, they're performing. Dinner begins with a hand-washing ritual, not with soap, mind you, but with scented water poured over the hands into silver bowls by trembling servants. It's not about cleanliness, it's about symbolism. Your hands are about to touch food that reflects your lineage, your virtue, your divine right to be served first. And what's being served? Let's talk about the menu. We start with roast swan, not chicken, not duck, swan. Its feathers removed, its body cooked and delicately seasoned, then dressed back up in its own plumage, because nothing says wealth like a bird wearing its own corpse. You may even be offered peacock, served similarly with bright tail feathers fully extended, turning your dinner table into a grotesque but colorful museum exhibit. And if that's not enough performance for you, imagine cutting into a pie and having live birds fly out of it. A real recipe from some of the more theatrical cookbooks of the time. Dinner in noble circles was part magic trick, part culinary flex, and part diplomatic ritual. The more exotic the dish, the more powerful the host. Imported spices, you're wealthy. Sugar, you're nearly royal. A whole roasted boar's head with an apple in its mouth. You probably own half the countryside. And then in a smoky little cottage just beyond the manor walls, someone else is also having dinner. A peasant family seated around a rough wooden table, likely with legs that don't match. The light comes not from candles, but from a small fire, or maybe the dying glow of the hearth. No embroidered cloth, no silver dishes, no peacocks, just a pot of turnip stew. Again, for the peasant, dinner wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive, functional. It was root vegetables boiled until they gave up, flavored with whatever herbs hadn't frozen yet, and served with a chunk of bread so hard it doubled as a tool during the day. Meat was a rare guest, maybe a sliver of bacon saved from a pig, slaughtered 6 months ago. Maybe a scrap of salted fish if it was Friday. Most likely it was a dinner without meat. Again, there were no courses, no entertainment, no delicate goblets of wine, just one big pot, one spoon, if you were lucky. One bowl passed around in silence except for the occasional cough or the tired sigh of someone who'd been digging all day. Now here's the kicker. Both meals, lord and peasant, started at roughly the same time. But where the noble dinner could stretch on for hours, complete with musicians, jesters, and multiple rounds of hand-washing, the peasant meal was over in 15 minutes. Maybe 20, if the bread was particularly chewy. And when it came to what was in those meals, the difference wasn't just dramatic. It was biblical. Nobles had access to sugar, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, spices from across the known world, each more expensive than gold by weight. They flavored their sauces, their meats, their desserts. Sweet and savory danced together in strange but luxurious combinations. Meat pies might be filled with raisins. Stews might taste faintly of nutmeg or ginger. These weren't just flavors. They were symbols, imported proof of wealth, power, and global connections. Meanwhile, peasants had salt. And if they were lucky, onions. And maybe some garlic if the landlord didn't tax the garden too heavily this year. Their flavors came from hardship, not indulgence. Historians still debate whether nobles genuinely enjoyed all these over-the-top dishes or if they were more for show. After all, stuffing a bird with another bird and then another bird and roasting the whole Frankensteinian creation on a spit for 6 hours isn't exactly about taste. It's about saying I can. But here's a quietly tragic irony. Peasants probably ate healthier. Nobles consumed massive amounts of red meat, sugar, and refined flour, what today's nutritionists might label a fast track to gout. In fact, gout was known as the disease of kings because it was. Peasants, on the other hand, had no choice but to eat a mostly plant-based diet. Turnips, onions, cabbage, leeks, rye bread, a bit of cheese, a little fish, lots of walking, no snacking, very little sugar. It wasn't trendy, it was necessity, but it worked. And yet, despite this health irony, the image of nobility, the long tables, the candlelight, the feathered birds and flowing wine persisted. It was the ideal, the fantasy, the thing you told your kids stories about while you chewed yesterday's stew. And maybe that's the most quietly heartbreaking part of all. Dinner, the thing we think of as comfort, safety, family. It was a daily reminder of the world's unfairness, who got to eat for pleasure and who ate only to not die, who laughed around the table and who ate in silence, who could choose from 100 dishes and who boiled the same vegetables every day for 40 years. Even the way people sat at dinner spoke volumes. Nobles sat on chairs with backs, cushions even. Peasants sat on stools or logs or the floor. You weren't just eating different food, you were sitting in a different world entirely. And yet, despite it all, people found joy. A bit of gravy stolen from the pot before the Lord saw, a fresh onion in spring, bread that wasn't moldy, a warm fire on a cold night, someone to share it with. Even if dinner was turnip soup again, it still mattered, because you'd made it through another day. And sometimes that was enough. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, maybe full from a dinner you chose for yourself, think about that. The quiet strength of people who sat down each night with almost nothing and still got up the next morning to do it all again. Let that thought wrap around you like a soft blanket. Let it slow your breath, dim your thoughts. And remember, dinner may have separated the rich and poor, but the need to eat to rest, to share those things, connect us all across every age. The meal is over, or at least it is if you're noble. You've eaten swan or maybe a peacock, reassembled into a feathery sculpture. You've wiped your fingers on linen-sipped sweet wine from a goblet etched with your family's crest, and perhaps laughed at a minstrel's rhyme while servants cleared your plates. But now let's talk about what comes next. Not dessert, not digestion, but something more subtle and, in many ways, more telling. Let's talk about what people drank. Because in medieval Europe, what you drank and how could split the world more cleanly than even dinner ever could. It's the year 1420 and we're in Burgundy, France. The vineyards are flush with grapes that stretch across the countryside like a quiet dream. But unless you're part of the nobility, you're probably not sipping fine wine made from those grapes. You're probably drinking something that, let's say, won't be written about in poetry. Let's begin gently with the privileged class. For them, wine wasn't a luxury, it was the default. Rich reds and delicate whites were brought out at every meal from breakfast to supper. Even young children in noble households drank watered-down versions. But make no mistake, even their watered wine was better than anything a peasant would ever taste. In Burgundy, where wine was practically a currency, noble families owned entire vineyards, carefully managed by generations of vintners. These wines were aged in oak barrels flavored with imported herbs and served in crystal or engraved silver goblets. They were sweetened with honey spiced with cinnamon or diluted to personal preference. Wine wasn't just for hydration, it was a statement. A sip of wine, especially a rare vintage from your own estate, said more about your status than any family crest ever could. And for the truly extravagant, There was mead, fermented honey wine, or hippocras, a spiced wine mixed with sugar herbs and ground ginger, often served warm. These drinks weren't just tasty, they were expensive. Their ingredients traveled from across continents carried by caravans and traded like treasure. Drinking them was like sipping power. But let's step down the staircase now, out of the great hall through the scullery, across a muddy path, and into a modest, thatched home where a peasant is preparing his evening drink. He's not sipping wine. He's not even dreaming about it. He's drinking ale, and not the hearty craft-brewed stuff you might order at a modern pub with artisanal fries. No, this is medieval ale, murky flat, sometimes sour, sometimes slightly chunky, and always a little suspicious. Medieval ale wasn't carbonated. It wasn't served cold. It wasn't hoppy or fruity or even particularly consistent. It was brewed at home often by women known as ale wives, and the result was, well, it varied a lot. Depending on what you had on hand, your ale might taste earthy, sweet, bitter, or like wet socks, and that's on a good day. But it was liquid, it was mildly alcoholic, and most importantly, it was safer than water. You see, in medieval Europe, water was a gamble. Rivers were often polluted with waste, both human and animal. Wells could run dry or become contaminated. Rainwater was inconsistent and needed to be stored carefully. So, unless you lived in a pristine rural area with access to mountain springs, and few people did, you didn't drink plain water. You drank something fermented, something that had been boiled or brewed or blessed by time and yeast. That meant ale for the working classes was a survival drink, not a vice, not a treat, just a necessity. And here's the irony, despite its murkiness. Medieval ale was relatively nutritious. It contained calories, a bit of grain protein, and trace minerals. For many peasants, it was as close to a multivitamin as they'd ever get. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Grandmothers drank it. It was low alcohol by modern standards, enough to kill bacteria, but not enough to make you tipsy after one mug. It was quite literally liquid bread. But if you're imagining a cheery tankard clinking at a medieval pub, slow that thought. Most peasant ale wasn't served in anything resembling a pub. It was poured from rough clay jugs or wooden buckets, sloshed into earthenware mugs with chipped rims. If you were lucky, you got one that didn't leak. And as for taste, let's just say ale had a reputation. There were jokes, quiet ones, peasant humor. It's so thick you can chew it, someone might say. Or it tastes like it forgot it was supposed to be drinkable. But they drank it anyway, because the alternative was thirst or worse, water from the village ditch. Meanwhile in town, Center's taverns quietly served stronger stuff. Cider if you were near apple orchards, braggot if you mixed your ale with honey and spices. And then there was wine for the poor, a thin, sour concoction made from leftover grape skins and stems soaked in water. It looked like wine. It smelled like regret. Interestingly, ale wasn't just a drink, it was an economy. Alewives often sold small batches from their homes, with reeds or symbols hung outside the door to indicate fresh brew. This gave some women rare financial independence. They brewed, they sold. They made a living until, of course, the church or the guilds stepped in and started regulating them out of business. Some records quietly suggest that many alewives were accused of scandalous conduct or dishonesty, not because they brewed bad ale, but because they dared to operate independently. They became symbols of suspicion. An unregulated woman with income and access to fermented grain that was almost witchcraft. And so the noblemen kept their vineyards, the church kept its mead and sacramental wines, and the peasantry kept drinking ale when it was available, when it hadn't gone bad, when it hadn't run out. Historians still debate whether people in the Middle Ages were drunk all the time. The answer is mostly no. The alcohol content was low and bodies adjusted. People drank ale like we drink coffee or tea today. It was routine, ritual, necessary. But there were dangers. Ale spoiled fast. It was brewed quickly without refrigeration and could turn sour within days. Poor storage meant contamination. Sometimes people got sick. Sometimes they quietly died. You didn't always know what was in your mug, but if it was wet and didn't kill you immediately, you drank it. Yet somehow drinking still had joy. In the evenings when work was done, villagers might gather around fires in fields and barns and pass around a jug. They'd tell stories, sing songs, or sit in silence, the ale warming their bellies, just enough to soften the day's edges. In noble halls, the drink was different, but the effect was the same. Goblets clinked, toasts were made, and laughter filled vaulted ceilings. Not because of the alcohol, necessarily, but because for a few moments everyone could pretend that the world wasn't so cruelly divided. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, consider what's in your glass. Water wine, tea, cider milk, from a carton, clean, clear, dependable. And think of them sitting in the dark, sipping warm ale that may or may not taste like damp hay, grateful still to have anything to drink at all. Let that thought swirl gently as you drift off a quiet toast to resilience, to bitter ale and better days. By now you've sat through a noble's dinner performance and choked down a peasant's turnip stew. You've sampled swan served with feather flare and ale that tastes like wet socks. But tonight we're going beyond the food and drink, into the invisible lines drawn at the table, the unspoken rules that told everyone where they stood. Let's talk about table manners, because in medieval Europe, how you ate often mattered just as much as what you ate. We're in London now. The year is 1435. The plague has passed for now. The economy is wobbling like a meat pie in a broken cart, and the streets are alive with merchants' mud and murmurs. But inside the homes of the wealthy, stone manors with timber frames and tapestries to keep out the chill, a quiet theater of dining etiquette is unfolding. It starts the moment you walk in. At a noble feast, you don't just sit where you like. You're assigned a place according to your status. If you're high-ranking clergy, visiting knight, or the Lord's cousin twice removed, but still useful, you'll find yourself at the high table, elevated both literally and socially. From there, you could look down physically at everyone else, a soft reminder of your place above them. Below you, in descending order, sit the lesser guests, merchants' favored servants, traveling scribes, and perhaps, if they've behaved, the steward's family. And far away near the doors, or the kitchen, are the ones you barely notice: junior servants, guards, and sometimes musicians. They get scraps, maybe. But don't get too comfortable. You're not at this table just to eat. You're performing refinement. Let's start with your hands. At formal dinners, nobles washed their hands before eating, not for hygiene. They had no germ theory yet, but for symbolism. Clean hands, cheers, clean soul. Servants poured rose water over guests' hands into ornate basins, often with lavender or rosemary. You weren't just being polite, you were publicly proving you were better than the mud-covered masses outside. Next, how you sat. Upright elbows off the table, no slouching. And for heaven's sake, don't lean on your left arm. While eating, that was considered slovenly. Your left hand stayed out of the way. The right hand did the work. Yes, even if you were left-handed. Sorry. Now comes the knife, a personal item. Everyone brought their own, since host-provided cutlery wasn't a widespread custom yet. Your knife had a pointed tip for spearing food and slicing meat. Forks. Those suspicious foreign tridents hadn't caught on in England yet. Using a fork in the early 1400s marked you as a little weird, a little decadent, and maybe a little unchristian. After all, why use a fork? When God gave you fingers, bread acted as a tool too. You could use it to push food onto your knife mop-up sauce or hold something too hot. The nobleman's bread was so soft and white it practically melted. The peasant's bread could be used to chisel stone. Different tools, different lives. At the noble table, speaking while eating was a delicate matter. Conversation was encouraged, but only certain types. Don't talk about politics unless you're a politician. Don't discuss religion unless you're clergy. Don't mention bodily functions. Don't laugh too loud. And if you're a woman, speak when spoken to. Quietly, with grace. Meanwhile, in a peasant household, none of this applied. Manners weren't performative. They were practical. You ate quickly, quietly, and with whoever happened to be home. Most often, the entire family gathered around a shared bowl or pot. Everyone dipped in with their hands or passed around the one wooden spoon. There were no napkins. You wiped your mouth on your sleeve or didn't bother at all. No place cards, no courses, no ceremony. Yet there were still rules, unspoken ones. The eldest got the first bite. Guests were offered meat if there was any. Children ate last or not at all if food ran short. Sharing was a necessity. Eating alone was considered strange or even antisocial. Meals weren't private, they were communal, and even in poverty, hospitality mattered. But back to the noble table where manners were meticulously recorded. Books like the Book of Courtesy or the Baby's Book instructed young aristocrats on proper behavior. They were filled with terrifyingly specific rules. Don't pick your teeth with your knife. Don't scratch yourself at the table. Don't sniffle, blow your nose, and excuse yourself. Don't let food fall from your mouth back onto your plate. Don't lick your fingers loudly. Don't talk with your mouth full. Some things never change. These books were part instruction manual, part warning. To be impolite wasn't just embarrassing, it could ruin your prospects. Good manners could help you marry well, get invited back, or get a job at court. Bad manners, they marked you as low-born no matter what your family claimed. And it wasn't just about personal pride. Table manners reinforced the system. They created distance between noble and commoner, between man and woman, between servant and master. Servants, for example, weren't expected to speak unless spoken to. If they were permitted to eat at all during a noble feast, they often waited until the guests had finished. Only then, when the meat was stripped, the sauces congealed, and the bread went stale. Could they take their portion, often standing up in a corner with their hands? Even how you drank said something about you. Nobles sipped delicately from goblets. Peasants swigged from shared jugs. There was no mine. The mug belonged to the table, the family, or whoever got to it first. But despite all these rigid codes, the real world was often messier. Nobles sometimes broke their own rules. A rich man might slurp loudly after too much wine. A bishop might belch. A lady might gossip. And peasants had their own quiet forms of etiquette built not on performance, but on survival and respect. You didn't snatch food. You didn't insult the cook. You shared what you had, even if it wasn't much. And there were odd exceptions. At weddings, rules relaxed. At funerals, people cried into their soup. During harvest feasts, everyone from lord to plowman might share a table, if only for one night. In those moments, the rules bent a little, but never too far. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were followed. Were the etiquette books aspirational, satirical, completely ignored by the average knight who just wanted more boar? Probably all of the above. But one thing's clear, manners were mirrors. They reflected who you were, who you wanted to be, and who you were expected to remain. For peasants, the lack of elaborate manners didn't mean a lack of dignity. It meant fewer layers between hunger and food. It meant survival trumped etiquette. But for the wealthy, the way you chewed, wiped, swallowed, and even sneezed could shape your future. So tonight, as you lie beneath clean sheets, perhaps with a full stomach and a napkin that's not your sleeve, reflect on how strange it is that something as simple as eating once required an entire handbook. And maybe be grateful no one's judging how you're holding your spoon. Let's wander now from the flickering candlelight of dining halls and the scraped bottom stew pots of peasant homes into the darker, quieter corner of every medieval kitchen, the part where things lasted. Because after you've eaten the feast, drunk, the ale wiped your mouth or not, and pushed back your stool, there's always one question lingering in the smoky air. What do we do with the rest? In modern life, preserving food is as simple as tossing leftovers into a fridge or freezing them for next week. But in 1450 Normandy, France, there are no refrigerators, no cling film, and certainly no microwaves for quick reheats. What there is instead is a quiet war against rot, a relentless daily battle to keep food edible just a little bit longer in a world that constantly smells of damp cellars and overripe cabbages. And like everything else in the medieval world, this war looked very different depending on who you were. Let's start as usual with the nobles. A noble kitchen was vast, its stone walls blackened with centuries of fire, its shelves lined with jars, casks, and strange-smelling pots. Within these walls, preservation was an art form. The wealthy had access to the medieval world's most precious weapon in the fight against spoilage, spice. Salt, of course, was king. It was the most common method of preservation and widely used across all classes. But nobles didn't just salt things, they transformed them. Meat was rubbed in elaborate spice blends cured for weeks, smoked in tall chimneys, and then layered with salt or sealed in fat. This wasn't just preservation, it was culinary showmanship. In the manor houses of Normandy, a chunk of pork could be buried under lard in a glazed pot, then stored in a cool room for months. This technique, called confit, was both practical and indulgent. You weren't just saving meat, you were saving it in style. Fish, too, was preserved with flair. Herring was pickled in brine eels, smoked until they resembled coiled snakes of charcoal, and anchovies packed in oil until they became little salt bombs ready to explode in stews or sauces. Fruits were candied or soaked in honey. Nuts were roasted and sealed in beeswax. Cheeses were wrapped in cloth, dunked in ash, or buried in hay to develop flavor and prevent mold. And some noble kitchens even kept ice harvested from frozen ponds and stored in deep pits covered in straw, creating a kind of medieval freezer, a luxury only the wealthiest could dream of. But spices were something else. Cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, pepper from India, these were treasures that traveled across continents, passed from trader to trader, and cost more than gold. A single pinch could disguise the taste of slightly off meat or elevate a mundane dish into something worth writing poems about. But now let's open the crooked wooden door of a peasant's home and peek inside their much smaller, much smokier kitchen, if it can even be called that. Here, preservation isn't decorative, it's desperation. Salt is still king, but here it's used sparingly. Salt is expensive, precious, often taxed. So instead of elaborate curing techniques, peasant families might simply rub meat with salt and hang it in the chimney to dry in the smoke of the hearth. This had a double benefit. It preserved the meat and gave it a smoky flavor, which was often the only flavor. And what if you didn't have meat? Then you preserved what you could get: cabbage, onions, beans, grains. Cabbages were buried in sand in cold corners of the home. Onions were braided and hung from ceiling beams like garlands of hardship. Beans were dried and stored in sacks. Grain was kept in barrels or tightly sealed crocks. Peasants didn't have much, but they knew how to stretch it. Root vegetables were buried underground near enough to retrieve in winter, deep enough to stay cold. Apples were wrapped in straw and stored in crates. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the harvest was good and the weather kind, there was cheese. Peasant cheese wasn't the creamy, sweet, delicate kind you might find at a noble feast. It was hard, dry, and often pungent, but it lasted. A hunk of it might be carved into tiny pieces and eaten over weeks, dipped in ale to soften it, or grated into porridge to disguise its toughness. Still, many preservation techniques were communal. Entire villages might smoke large amounts of fish or meat together, especially after slaughter. Everyone would bring their share, hang it in a large smokehouse, and wait for days as the air thickened with the scent of burning juniper or oak. And when things went bad, which they inevitably did, peasants didn't throw food away. They reused it. A spoiled stew might be boiled again with vinegar to mask the taste. Mold was scraped off bread. Fermented cabbage, what we might now call sauerkraut, was both a preservation technique and a way to eat vegetables in the dead of winter. Even bones were boiled repeatedly to make broth. A single ham bone might be used for weeks, dropped into pot after pot of thin soup, giving just enough flavor to trick the tongue into thinking it was meat. Meanwhile, nobles had entire pantries, cold rooms, butteries, larders dedicated to preservation. Specialized staff managed them. The larderer ensured meats were stored correctly. The butler oversaw wine and ale. The spicerer guarded precious seasonings. Food in these households had infrastructure, but no matter how elaborate the system, food still spoiled. Mice got into the grain. Mold crept into the cheese. Meat went rancid. And sometimes when the wind was wrong and the barrels leaked, entire stores were lost. And here's where things got complicated. Spoilage wasn't evenly punished. When noble stores failed, they could send for more. They had estates, connections, coins. But when a peasant's salted pork went bad, that might mean no protein until spring. If the onions rotted or the beans got weevils, the family didn't just skip dinner, they faced starvation. That's why preservation was sacred. Recipes weren't written, they were passed down, whispered, protected. Mothers taught daughters how to salt just right. Fathers taught sons where the ground stayed coldest year-round. Preservation wasn't a technique, it was survival magic. And yet, despite all the hardship, there were clever solutions everywhere. Clay pots sealed with animal fat, linen soaked in vinegar, milk turned into curds, wine turned into vinegar. Nothing went to waste. Even ashes from the hearth were used, scattered in storage jars to repel insects, or rubbed on cheese to form a protective layer against mold. Historians still argue about just how effective these methods were. Some say peasant food was almost always on the verge of going bad. Others point out that many preservation techniques used by the poor fermentation, smoking, drying are still used today, and were in fact incredibly effective when done properly. One thing is certain: preserving food wasn't just about extending shelf life. It was about extending hope. Every dried apple ring hung in the rafters was a promise you'll make it to spring. Every jar of beans on the shelf was a defense against the next failed harvest. Every slab of smoked fish tucked into a corner meant one more warm night with something hot in your belly. So tonight, as you sip your tea or tuck away your leftovers, think about what it meant to keep food alive in a time when cold was constant, rot was relentless, and hunger was always just a few bad weeks away. Think about the fingers that salted the pork, wrapped the onions, hung the cheese. They weren't just preserving food, they were preserving futures. And that's worth remembering. Let's take a break tonight. Not from our journey through medieval kitchens, pantries, and dinner tables, but from the daily grind of porridge, stew, and spoiled turnips. Because even the poorest peasants, the most overfed lords, and the most pious monks needed something to look forward to. Something sweeter, warmer, louder. Something that smelled like roasted chestnuts and cheap ale. Tonight we're at a medieval festival. The year is 1475, the place a small village tucked into a fold of Bavaria's rolling hills. The air is cool, scented with wood smoke and the distant tang of cow dung. But for once no one minds, because today is St. Martin's Day, a harvest festival. And that means one thing: everyone eats well, even the poor. The narrow dirt roads that normally echo only with the sound of hooves and muttered complaints are now packed with neighbors. Farmers, blacksmiths, spinners, bakers, children with grubby cheeks and bare feet. Music wheezes from an old fiddle. A pig is roasting slowly on a spit. Someone selling warm ale in dented mugs. And just for today, the lines between lord and laborer blur. Because festival food had a quiet magic. It didn't erase hunger, it didn't undo injustice, but for one day, it made things feel a little more equal, at least in the mouth. Let's start with the centerpiece: roasted meat. For most peasants, meat was a rare and distant dream. Maybe they'd eat it on Easter. Maybe they'd see it at a wedding. But during a festival, you might actually get a piece of pork. Or if the village was really lucky, a goose, browned and glistening, its fat sizzling onto the fire. Now don't imagine a private serving. This wasn't a buffet. It was more like a communal grab. Someone, usually the lord or the church, offered the animal. It was cooked outdoors, carved in large slabs, and distributed with chaotic fairness, elders first, children after, the rowdiest drunk guy somewhere in between. And then there were the fritters. You heard right, medieval donuts. Dough fried in animal fat, dusted if available with sugar or ash, or powdered herbs. Sweet, greasy, golden. They weren't sold from food trucks or donut shops, but made in big iron pans set over coals. Every village had its own version passed down from someone's grandmother, who swore by 3 turns of the spoon and never stir counterclockwise. Even fruit became special. Apples, dried all winter, were soaked and stewed with honey. Pears were baked into crude pies with thick rye crusts. Berries were mashed and mixed into drinks or spread on bread. And then there were the nuts: roasted chestnuts, walnuts cracked with stones, hazelnuts thrown into the fire until they popped open like tiny promises. But the true star of any festival: alcohol. Ale flowed like gossip, weak, warm, and everywhere. Monks sometimes provided it. The manor house might donate a few casks. Villagers brought their own brews, each slightly off but deeply beloved. Drinking wasn't just about celebration. It was survival, liberation, and connection. You weren't drunk, you were festive. For the lucky and ambitious, there was mead or cider, sweet, smooth, and rare, reserved for weddings, saints' days, or the occasional miracle. Historians still argue about how often peasants really celebrated. Were festivals frequent, or just fondly remembered? Some say there were dozens of saint days, many marked by food and fun. Others argue that between famine, plague, and taxes, joy was a rare commodity. But food tells its own truth. Records show spikes in animal slaughter before big festivals. Accounts mention barrels of flour suddenly disappearing from stores. Monks wrote of fasting and then feasting. And perhaps most telling of all, peasants remembered festival food in their stories, their songs, and their curses. Because when you rarely ate well, you never forgot the day you did. Let's take a moment to wander through this imagined festival. Children dart between stalls, chasing each other with sticky hands and pockets full of roasted peas. A woman ladles warm soup, thicker than usual, into mismatched bowls. A man in patched trousers tries to juggle apples, fails, laughs anyway. Someone's boiling honey in a pot over fire, adding herbs. Medicinal, they say, handing it out in wooden cups. It tastes like cough syrup and hope. Old women pass around soft cheese wrapped in cabbage leaves. A group of boys roast onions on sticks, blowing the steam away before daring a bite. A girl quietly gnaws on a dried sausage she's been saving since morning. And in the distance you can just make out the high table set up for the nobility. Their dishes are fancier, their mugs cleaner. But they're also watching the crowd, because tonight even they know the real joy is down there, in the clatter, the crumbs, and the laughter. Now not all was fair or joyful. Food still ran out. Fights still broke out over the last slice of pie. Some villagers drank too much. Some families stayed home too poor to spare even a moment of celebration. But for many, this was their Christmas birthday, and vacation rolled into one. A chance to remember what full felt like. And here's something quietly, radical festival food gave peasants a taste of power. For one day you didn't ask permission. You didn't bow before eating. You didn't ration. You ate until you were full. Maybe even more. You tried the nobleman's roast. You drank from the same barrel as the blacksmith. You danced. And food, always food, made it possible. Even the church, normally a source of restriction, encouraged feasting. After long periods of fasting, they approved rich, joyous meals on feast days. Not because they wanted people to indulge, but because they knew joy mattered. A celebration with food at the center reminded even the poorest soul that life wasn't only toil. Historians say that in some towns, leftovers from noble feasts were distributed to the poor, a kind of medieval charity. Others claim festivals were cleverly timed to ensure peasants stayed compliant, fed just enough to keep their spirits from cracking completely. Both may be true. But here's the reality: when you're biting into a roasted chestnut with juice on your chin, politics feel far away. Because food isn't just calories, it's comfort, memory, connection. The child who tastes honeyed figs at the harvest fair doesn't just eat fruit. She remembers sweetness, warmth, her mother's smile, the way the music sounded that night. The old man who drinks hot broth next to the fire doesn't just feed his body, he softens his sorrow. And so as the festival winds down and the fire dims, people go home slowly, stomachs full, pockets empty, heads buzzing. And though they'll wake tomorrow to muddy boots and aching backs, they'll remember tonight the smells, the tastes, the laughter, and they'll carry that memory through winter. So tonight, as you settle under your blanket, maybe with something warm in your hand or a snack at your side, think of them, of the girl with the sausage, the boy with the onion, the grandmother wiping crumbs from her lips and whispering, "Not bad this year." And know that for all the hardship, for all the quiet suffering, medieval life had its moments of light, of flavor, of joy, even if only for a day. The fires from the festival have gone out. The chestnut shells lie scattered in the dirt. The laughter has faded into snores. And as the village returns to its rhythm back to muddy fields and smoky kitchens, the sweetness lingers just a little longer. Because tonight we talk about something rare, something precious, something that even the most powerful lord couldn't always count on. Dessert. The word itself barely existed in 1480 Portugal, where we now find ourselves in a sun-bleached town nestled between rolling hills and the salt-swept Atlantic. Dessert, as we think of it, was still a vague concept. It wasn't yet the grand finale of every meal tied up in ribbons and whipped cream. It was fleeting, occasional, often improvised. But when it appeared, it was magic. Let's begin as always with the nobles. A Portuguese nobleman in 1480 might finish his dinner with preserved fruits, quinces cooked down into sticky marmalade spiced with cinnamon or cloves. The sugar, if it was there at all, came from far-off plantations still new, still rare, still so valuable that it was stored in locked boxes guarded like treasure. If you served sweet dishes at court, you weren't just being generous. You were announcing your wealth, your connections to trade routes, and your understanding of the new fashionable culinary language spreading through Europe. A noble dessert might include rice pudding, thickened with goat's milk and sweetened with honey, or almond cakes, soft and chewy from ground nuts, imported from Islamic Spain. Sometimes candied orange peel appeared, its bitterness balanced with syrup, like the noble families themselves, harsh but polished. If you were extraordinarily lucky or obscenely rich, you might be served golden yolk-based sweets, the kind that later became Portugal's famous ovos moles. These eggy delicacies were born in monasteries where nuns had an abundance of yolks left over after using the whites to starch habits or clarify wine. Rather than waste them, they beat them with sugar and created creamy miracles in crusty shells. But for the vast, vast majority of medieval people, especially peasants, dessert was not a course. It was a coincidence. A piece of fruit, a crust of bread dipped in wine, a fig dried in the rafters, a bit of honey licked from the edge of a spoon. That was dessert. Peasants didn't expect sweet things. They stumbled into them. If you were lucky, your apple tree had a good year, and a few bruised ones didn't rot before you could eat them. If the bees didn't die and the weather held, you might get a spoonful of honey. If someone brought sugar from the market in the city, you might taste a pinch on your birthday. And often what passed for a treat wasn't sweet at all. Peasant dessert might be a bit of cheese or roasted chestnuts with a little salt, or once in a blue moon, a cake. Let's be generous with that word. Medieval peasant cakes were nothing like your modern sponge layers or cream-topped dreams. They were dense, dry, often unleavened and sweetened only with dried fruit or leftover beer. But they were special. They were shared. And they were remembered. Because even when food was hard, flavor was memory. A child who tasted pear stew, sweetened with honey on Christmas Eve, would remember it forever. A worker who bit into bread sprinkled with dried currants during the harvest festival would talk about it for years. These weren't just desserts, they were landmarks in a flavorless world. And sometimes joy came from making do. In Portugal, it was common for families to boil down leftover wine into a thick syrup called vinho quente and pour it over stale bread. It wasn't elegant, but it was warm, and for one moment you could close your eyes and pretend you were a merchant's son. Some villagers made rudimentary caramel burning honey until it darkened and cooled into a hardened sheet. They'd crack it into pieces with the butt of a knife and let children suck on them until bedtime. Sticky fingers, silent smiles, temporary bliss. Others roasted fig leaves and steeped them in milk to create a kind of herbal pudding. It was strange, slightly bitter, but better than nothing, and better than nothing was often the highest culinary praise a peasant could offer. Let's return now to the monasteries, strangely the beating heart of medieval dessert innovation. In 15th century Portugal, convents were dessert factories. Not intentionally, but by necessity. They had eggs, milk, herbs, and thyme. And more importantly, they had discipline, the kind that made perfecting a simple tart into a holy act. From their kitchens came egg yolk sweets that bordered on luxurious, pão de ló, an airy sponge, touchinho do céu, literally bacon from heaven, made with almonds and lard. These weren't everyday desserts. They were offerings, dowry gifts, religious symbols. And because they came from nuns, they were both virtuous and seductive, a strange but holy paradox. Historians still argue, did these nuns invent dessert as we know it? Maybe. Maybe not. But they certainly elevated it. Back outside the cloister walls, the idea of dessert remained fragile. Weather ruined fruit crops. Warfare disrupted trade. Famine canceled festivals. And sugar, always sugar, remained out of reach. One small note here, sugar was considered medicinal by medieval doctors. You could actually get a prescription for sweet syrup if you were rich and sick. It was called a lectuary, and it was basically jam with an ego. But peasants couldn't afford sweet medicine. They cured what ailed them with garlic prayer or ale. Yet in all these layers, court, convent, cottage dessert persisted. Not because it was necessary, but because it was human. Because there is something universal about the desire for sweetness at the end. Whether it's the final course of a meal, the end of a hard day, or the last moment before sleep, we crave something soft, warm, and good. Something to say. You've made it this far. Here's a little sweetness for the road. So tonight, as you nibble a cookie, sip tea with honey, or stare longingly at your fridge before bed, remember this. There was once a time when sweetness came once a year, when honey on your bread meant joy, when dried pears were whispered about for months. And yet they found ways to make do, to enjoy, to remember, because dessert isn't just about sugar, it's about hope. The belief that after the bitterness, something better comes. That after work, there's a reward. That even in the coldest seasons, even in the darkest kitchens, something sweet can happen. The stew pot is cooled. The bread has gone stale. The honey is scraped from the jar. But there's one more element on the medieval plate that shaped not just meals, but meaning. Tonight we gently step into the quiet spaces where food met faith. It's 1495 in Rome. The bells toll softly from a distant monastery. A breeze carries the scent of incense through narrow streets. And on every table, humble or ornate, the meal begins not with a bite, but with a pause. Because in the late Middle Ages, what you ate when you ate and why you ate was deeply entangled with something far more powerful than hunger religion. Let's begin with the church, not the building, but the institution. Because by this time, the Catholic Church didn't just guide your soul, it scheduled your meals, It told you when to feast, when to fast, and what ingredients were fit for the body and the spirit. Out of 365 days in a year, over 150 were fasting days for the average medieval Christian. That's almost half the year. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, and Saint Feasts all came with dietary restrictions. Meat was often forbidden. Animal fats, no milk, depends. Eggs only, sometimes. But fish was holy loophole number one. Why fish? Because it wasn't meat, at least not in the theological sense. The church classified animals into warm-blooded bad for fasting and cold-blooded acceptable. That meant eels were fine. Whale meat. Also fish, apparently. Even beaver tails, yes tails were allowed because they lived in water and were considered fish-like. You can almost hear the medieval logic bending under the weight of its own hunger. And so markets across Christian Europe, especially in Rome, were flooded with fish during fasting seasons. Dried cod from the north, anchovies from the Mediterranean, salted herring from the Baltic. The church's fasting policy created entire fish-based economies. But of course, not everyone could afford salted cod wrapped in cloth and kissed by spices. So let's step away from the Vatican and into a peasant household somewhere outside the city. It's a Friday, and Fridays in Catholic tradition were fast days. That means no meat, no bacon in the stew, no lard in the bread, no meat pies, sausages, or fat drippings. So what's for dinner? Likely a pot of vegetable soup seasoned with whatever was growing and whatever wasn't sinful. Maybe lentils, maybe cabbage, maybe a few dried peas soaking since sunrise, a chunk of rye bread dipped in water, a prayer, and that's it. If you lived near a river or coast, you might get fish if the nobles hadn't already taken it. And if you didn't, then you chewed slowly and said grace a little longer. Peasants didn't fast for spiritual refinement. They fasted because they were told to, and because their bodies had already been fasting for weeks anyway. There's a quiet tragedy in that being told to give up something you never had. Meanwhile, in wealthier households, fasting looked different. The rich obeyed the rules technically, but they found creative loopholes. They substituted butter with almond milk made from ground almonds and rosewater. They hired cooks who could disguise fish to taste like meat. Some noble homes even commissioned chefs to sculpt faux meat out of fish using sugar, spices, and food dyes. Imagine sitting down to what looks like a roast goose, only to discover it's actually pike, molded into shape, and painted with saffron. Fasting never felt so festive. There was even a practice of fast day feasts, where nobles outdid themselves, preparing the most elaborate decadent meals that just happened to follow the church's rules. No meat, but yes, to oysters, spiced eel sweet wine, and cheese tarts made without actual cheese. It was essentially a loophole buffet for the spiritually ambitious and the gastronomically spoiled. But not all fasting was indulgent. In monasteries, fasting was taken seriously. Meals were reduced to 2 per day. Silence was observed. No meat, no sweetness, no indulgence. Just bread, beans, broth, and prayer. Still, even here, food had power. Fasting was about control, denying the body to elevate the soul. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a test of discipline, of devotion, of humility, and sometimes of survival. Because if a poor family lost their only pig just before Lent, they didn't eat meat for 40 days because they couldn't, not because they wouldn't. But still they fasted and they prayed and they hoped that God and the local priest might understand the difference. Fasting rules weren't just personal, they were communal. Church bells signaled meal times. Monks announced fast days. Children learned the liturgical calendar before they could write their names. And the entire rhythm of the year, the planting, the harvesting, the slaughtering, was built around the church's dietary demands. You didn't just eat for energy, you ate for penance, for praise, for permission. And when it was finally time to break the fast, say Easter Sunday, the joy was real. Imagine after 40 days of vegetable soup and dried peas, someone hands you a slice of lamb, a soft egg boiled in herbs, a fresh white loaf. You don't just eat, you rejoice. Easter feasts weren't just religious, they were redemptive. People cried, laughed, drank too much, passed around baskets of dyed eggs and sweet rolls as though they were gold. Even the food was symbolic. Eggs for new life, lamb for sacrifice, honey for God's sweetness, wine for Christ's blood. Every bite told a story. And here's something beautiful: food made faith tangible. You couldn't always understand theology. You couldn't read Latin. You didn't know what the bishop was chanting. But you knew that on Wednesday you ate fish, on Friday you fasted, and on Easter Sunday you feasted. Faith came with flavor, structure, sacrifice, and even rebellion. Because yes, some people broke the rules. They ate meat in secret. They paid indulgences to skip fasting days. They bribed clergy. They whispered their sins and hoped nobody noticed the smell of roast chicken wafting from their window during Lent. Historians argue over how common this was, but human nature suggests pretty common. Still, guilt lingered. And that guilt was, oddly enough, part of the meal. Religion didn't just shape what you ate, it shaped how you felt about eating. Were you grateful? Were you gluttonous? Did you savor too much? Did you take more than your share? Even the simplest bowl of pottage came with moral weight. But there's comfort in that too, because in a chaotic world where war, plague, poverty, and politics ruled food, and faith provided certainty, you didn't need to understand the cosmos. You just needed to know what to eat on Wednesday. And sometimes that was enough. So tonight, as you prepare your own meal, or perhaps simply finish your day, pause just for a moment, not to fast, not to feast, but to remember that for centuries, every bite was a ritual, a way to touch something larger, a whispered prayer in the language of soup and bread, a quiet hope served warm. We've talked about what people ate, we've talked about when and why and how, but tonight we step into the place where all of it happened, where the magic or monotony simmered day after day. Welcome to the medieval kitchen. And tonight we're going behind the scenes, behind the feasts, behind the broths and bannocks and blackened bread, behind the noise of the great hall and the silence of the peasant hearth. Because if food was the soul of medieval life, the kitchen was its smoky, sooty, sweat-drenched, beating heart. It's the year 1500 and we're in the back corner of a Parisian noble household, not the kind with a dozen lords lounging about, but a wealthy enough home to keep several staff and own more than one spoon. The kitchen is not the open concept Pinterest dream you're imagining. It's not even cozy. It's a stone room, dark and damp, lit only by firelight and occasional shafts of daylight from slitted windows up near the ceiling. The walls are black with soot. The air is warm. Not the comforting kind, but the suffocating, smoky kind that clings to your skin and tastes like burnt onions. And there's movement everywhere. A boy is turning a spit, his arms aching. A woman is kneading dough with both fists, sweat glistening at her temples. A pot bubbles near the hearth, and no one is exactly sure what's in it anymore. Something that was fish, or goat, possibly both. The kitchen is chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos all the same, and it has to be, because this kitchen isn't cooking for a family of 4. It's cooking for dozens. On feast days, maybe hundreds. In noble homes, cooking was a performance just like everything else. And the cooks, they were the unseen cast. Let's meet a few. At the top, there's the master cook. Usually a man. He doesn't just stir stews, he plans menus, manages budgets, oversees staff, and makes sure the food says what it's supposed to say, which is usually something like, "We are richer than you." Under him are assistants, butchers, roasters, pastry men, and the sauciers. Yes, even in the 1500s, someone's whole job was to make sauce. Because when your goose is dry, nothing saves you like a good almond garlic drizzle. And don't forget the scullery workers, the lowest of the low. These poor souls scrub pots, carry water-clean floors, pluck feathers, and fetch firewood. Their hands are raw, their backs are bent, their reward. Usually, not being hit. The kitchen hierarchy is as rigid as the nobility's seating chart. Everyone has a place. Everyone knows the rules. Because in the noble kitchen, a single mistake, a burnt bird, a missing spice, a cold pie could mean more than embarrassment. It could mean punishment, or worse, unemployment. Meanwhile, just a few alleys away, a peasant woman is starting her own dinner. There's no staff here, no budget, no menu. Just her hands, a small clay hearth, and whatever she has left from yesterday. The peasant kitchen isn't a separate room. It's a corner, a space near the door, a place that doubles as sleeping area, laundry zone, and animal pen when the weather gets bad. There is one pot, one spoon, maybe a knife, no shelves, no oven, no counters, and yet she cooks, because she has to. First, she starts the fire. This isn't easy. There's no matchbox, no lighter. She strikes flint against steel, trying not to waste precious tinder. Once it catches, she feeds it slowly. Sticks, straw, maybe dried dung if wood is scarce. Then she adds water to the pot, cold from the well, heavy to carry. It takes a long time to boil. Meanwhile, she chops vegetables, or what passes for vegetables. A cabbage core, some onions, a wrinkled carrot, dried beans if she's lucky. The stew simmers. The children cry. She stirs, slowly, always slowly. And maybe for a moment it smells good. This kitchen doesn't have a menu. It has memories. The stew tastes like every stew before it, which isn't comforting, but it is survivable. Back in the noble house, the kitchen runs like a machine, at least on good days. The fires burn constantly, even in summer. The heat is unbearable. People faint. Sometimes they don't wake up. Burns are common. So are cuts. There's no first aid, no ointment, no sympathy. And the food? It's extravagant. Peacocks stuffed with saffron rice. Meat pies sculpted into animals. Spices so expensive they're kept in locked chests. Everything glistens, smells sweet, tastes exotic. But the people who make it never eat it. Cooks in noble homes ate after the lords. Whatever was left. Often the burned bits, the crusts, the offcuts. They could cook better than kings, but they dined like beggars. The irony wasn't lost on them, but hunger dulls outrage, and pride doesn't fill your belly. In contrast, peasant kitchens were small, smoky kingdoms. Women ruled here. Recipes weren't written, they were passed down by hand and taste and smell. Everyone knew that if mother said, "Add just enough salt," you didn't measure, you felt. There were no pastry towers, but there was bread and broth and survival, and sometimes, just sometimes, something wonderful. A hedgehog roasted on stones, a pie made from wild berries, a cake flavored with cider, little luxuries hard-earned, because peasant kitchens weren't about flair. They were about faith that the food would stretch. that the fire would catch, that tomorrow there'd be something left. And there was joy too. Children stealing bits from the pot, neighbors trading onions for eggs, old women muttering spells into the broth just in case. These weren't sterile kitchens. They were living, breathing, hissing places full of noise and mess and meaning. Even the tools told stories. The ladle carved by a grandfather. The pot passed down for generations. The flat stone used to grind herbs that grew wild in the hedgerow. Meanwhile, the noble kitchens used tools of brass and tin imported and engraved, spits large enough to roast a cow, rolling pins made of marble, skimmers and sieves, tongs and pokers. Technology for its time. But all kitchens, noble or not, shared one thing. They were dangerous. Fires could spread, knives slipped, food spoiled, rats crept in, infections brewed in wounds. Ash fell into everything. There were no gloves, no ventilation, no guarantees. And yet food kept coming, because kitchens, smoky, sweaty, sacred, were where life happened. Where children were fed, where lovers whispered, where grief simmered and joy sizzled. So tonight, as you tiptoe into your kitchen, bright, tiled, humming softly, with modern miracles, think of them. Of the boy turning the spit, the woman stirring the pot, the nun in her cold cloister slicing quince for jam, the grandmother pressing dough with her palms. They cooked not for pleasure, not for art, but because someone somewhere needed to eat. And that is a kind of love, too. By now we've tasted the porridge, sniffed the stew, choked on the gritty bread, and wiped our hands on our sleeves. We've peeked behind the smoke-stained curtains of medieval kitchens, watched the boy turning the spit, the woman grinding herbs, the scullery maid, scrubbing pots that never quite come clean. But tonight we turn to something different, something stranger. Let's explore the quiet but curious ways. Medieval people believed that food could heal or harm, because in the year 1510, in a town like Oxford, England, food wasn't just food. It was medicine, magic, and mystery all ladled into the same bowl. And who made those bowls matter? Let's start as usual with the rich. A nobleman wakes up with a headache. He calls for his household physician, who arrives not with pills but with a list of herbs and a stern warning about imbalanced humors. Yes, humors. The prevailing medical theory of the Middle Ages was that the human body was governed by 4 substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When balanced, you were healthy. When imbalanced, you were, well, medieval. How did these humors get unbalanced? Everything. The weather, the moon, your emotions, your personality, your lunch. Every food was classified by qualities: hot or cold, dry or wet. Bread was dry and warm, cheese was cold and moist. Fish. That depended on the fish. Everything had a temperature and a texture, spiritually speaking. So, if your noble stomach was upset, it might not be because you overindulged in pickled eel. It might be because the eel was cold and moist, and your body needed something hot and dry to balance it. That meant a prescribed food, often something spiced like gingered wine, or a paste of warm nuts and pepper, or maybe a piece of toasted bread rubbed with garlic and dipped in vinegar. That could cure a headache, or indigestion, or melancholy, depending on the phase of the moon. And if things were really serious, you'd be prescribed a cooling food, or told to avoid pork, or most famously, you'd be bled. That's right. A good meal of boiled nettles followed by a cup of wine and a few ounces of your blood drained with a lancet. But for all its strangeness, this wasn't nonsense to them. It was deeply logical. If you lived in a world where everything was mysterious, Now let's peek into the herbal gardens of monasteries where monks grew plants not for decoration but for salvation. Chamomile to calm the nerves, sage for memory, rosemary for headaches, mustard seeds for the lungs, fennel for gas, and garlic was basically medieval Tylenol. They used it for infections, parasites, digestion, even as protection against plague. The smell considered proof of its power. Monks didn't just grow herbs, they wrote books about them. Manuscripts called herbals filled with drawings and descriptions, some wildly accurate, some wildly imaginative. One claimed mandrake roots screamed when pulled from the ground. Still, when a monk made you a tonic of honey, vinegar, and thyme, you drank it. Because it might not cure your body, but it felt like someone was trying. And now let's return gently to the peasant. In her little home, the mother has no physician, no monk, no book. But she has knowledge passed from her mother, and her mother's mother, and every woman before them. She knows that boiled onion skins make a tea that eases cough, that mint leaves help stomach pains, that nettles dried and steeped can bring back a little strength in the spring. She knows that fats smeared with crushed herbs can draw out infection, that hot stones wrapped in rags help aching joints, that chewing licorice root is good for the mouth. And if she doesn't know, she asks the cunning woman, the local healer, part herbalist, part midwife, part rumor. She has no license, but everyone goes to her when things get bad. She might prescribe a food, a charm, a hot soup, stirred in silence and left overnight. Her power is local, whispered, respected, until the church notices and suddenly she's suspect. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the foods themselves. Certain items were known not just for flavor, but for healing powers. Some were correct by today's standards. Some were creative. Take leeks. Beloved by the Welsh, used in broths, stews, and worn on hats during battle. Yes, really, they were believed to strengthen the voice and cleanse the blood. Honey was a wonder, used in wound care, sore throats, and even as an ingredient in embalming. It preserved, sweetened, and healed. Vinegar, a cleanser and tonic. Mixed with herbs, it became four thieves' vinegar, said to protect against the plague. Beer was considered healthier than water. Not because of the alcohol, but because the boiling process killed bacteria, though no one knew that's what was happening. They just knew you didn't die after drinking beer. And then there were the more imaginative cures. Got gout, eat boiled badger meat, spoiler don't. To cure baldness, rub the fat of a goose on your head, or ash of burned bees, or a mixture of honey and horse urine. Please don't. And if you couldn't sleep, try lettuce soup, or wine infused with poppy seeds, or just sheer exhaustion. The line between food and medicine was blurry, which was fine because it was often the same thing. And that's where the medieval kitchen became a kind of pharmacy, a place not just of hunger and heat, but of care. A woman stirring a pot of lentils was also making a healing meal for a child with fever. A monk mashing garlic into wine was preparing a plague remedy. A father soaking bread in warm milk wasn't just making breakfast. He was trying to bring someone back to life. And sometimes it worked. Or at least they believed it did. And belief matters because when you live in a world where doctors are rare, hospitals are terrifying, and death is always nearby, you cling to the comfort of warm soup and familiar hands. Food heals, even when it doesn't cure. Still, not all healing was gentle. Let's not forget that access to food, to variety, freshness, and even meat was itself a form of medicine. A poor diet led to scurvy, rickets, weakness, and early death. The rich lived longer not because they had better doctors, but because they had more calories. Yet even among the poor people found ways to cope. They grew herbs on windowsills, shared onions in the winter, traded eggs for garlic, saved the marrow bones for soup, preserved elderberries, planted mustard, dried yarrow. Healing happened where you could find it, in a cup of broth, a crust of bread soaked in vinegar, a spoonful of honey stirred into oat porridge, and if it didn't work, at least you tried. And at least it tasted like someone still hoped for you. So tonight, if you're sick, tired, or just worn thin, make something warm. Tea, soup, toast, anything. And remember, for hundreds of years, that's all most people ever had. Not medicine, not science, but food offered gently with hands that tried their best. We're near the end now. The bowls are empty. The hearth embers are fading. The stew has gone cold, and someone has set the bread to dry for tomorrow's trenchers. All that's left is reflection, and maybe a few bones to pick clean. But before we slip into our final thoughts, we pause here in the year 1525 near the tail end of the medieval period to look back at everything that food meant, not just the hunger, not just the cooking, but the quiet daily truth that meals, tiny, repetitive, often forgettable, were never just meals. They were dividers and connector symbols and tools, acts of survival and acts of power. Let's walk back through the world we've just journeyed across slowly, like retracing our footsteps through a muddy lane at dusk. You remember the breakfast, don't you? The cold porridge, the sour ale, the bread that doubled as both plate and punishment. For the poor, breakfast wasn't a beginning, it was a continuation of fatigue, of silence, of doing what had to be done, but for the rich, breakfast was optional, indulgent. A platter of pastries, a goblet of mulled wine, a luxury eaten late, a quiet display of time. And then there was lunch. If you were a peasant, it wasn't called lunch. It was called a break. If it was called anything at all, maybe a bowl of perpetual stew. Maybe just a hunk of yesterday's crust, gnawed in the shade. No ceremony, no table, no time to think about it. But across the fields and the manors and courts, lunch was a course, with plates and platters and social rules so thick you could slice them like a meat pie. And dinner, dinner was the theater. For nobles it was performance, roasted peacocks, painted pies, sauces of saffron and cinnamon served in silver. For peasants it was boiled onions, turnips. Whatever didn't spoil, dinner didn't end the day it sealed it. Even the drinks divided them. Wine sweet and spiced spoke of trade and power. Ale murky and homemade bubbled with necessity. The noble sipped to savor. The peasant drank to survive. And dessert, that was the real fantasy. For most people it came only once a year, if ever. A smear of honey, a bruised pear, a crust of fried dough. Nothing like the sugary spectacles of the elite. But for a hungry child, even a fig dried on a string could be magic. We've watched them preserve food, not just for taste, but for life. In jars, in salt, in ash, in faith. We've seen them pray over it, suffer for it, sneak it, share it. We've seen fasting that was spiritual, for some imposed on others. Kitchens that were kingdoms of chaos or corners of calm. Foods that healed and foods that harmed. Foods that whispered you belong and others that shouted you don't. Meals marked the rhythm of life. Birth, marriage, death. You ate when you could, what you could, how you could. And every bite told a story of hierarchy, a story of hope, a story of people finding comfort in the only place they could, a warm bowl, a shared loaf, a spoon carved by someone they loved. And here's something else. No matter how poor you were, how tired, how hungry, how unwashed or unlettered, when you ate, you took part in something universal. In every village and city, monastery and manor, at every wooden stool and every high table, people bent over their food in silence, or in song, or in prayer. They broke bread with friends, shared onions with neighbors, poured broth for the sick, boiled nettles for the dying. They kept each other alive with food made not from abundance but from care. Because in the end, food wasn't just about calories. It was about dignity. It was about agency. It was about saying, we're still here, we're still trying, we're still cooking. So tonight, before you turn off the lights, maybe peek into your fridge. Not to snack, just to look, to remember how much is there, how rare that once was, how lucky we are to have more than just enough, and to be reminded gently, quietly, that somewhere centuries ago someone held a spoon over a fire in the dark and whispered, "Please let this be enough." Close your eyes now. Breathe in softly. Let the smoke fade. Let the porridge cool. Let the bread go still. You've walked through a world of hunger and heat, of bitter herbs and honeyed figs, of greasy fingers and cracked bowls. You've seen what food meant when it was hard-earned, not handed over a counter. And you've learned that even in the most miserable times, the act of eating, of making food, sharing it, surviving with it, was an act of quiet grace. Not loud, not glorious, but enduring. The medieval world is far behind us now, but its echoes remain in your kitchen, your cupboard, your rituals, in the way you pour tea when you're sad, in the soup you make when someone's sick, in the bread you bake even when there's store-bought on the shelf. Because cooking at its core is always an act of care, of memory, of resistance even. A way to say, we lived. We made something from nothing. We mattered. So let the night settle. Let the pots rest. Let the stories grow quiet. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into sleep together.